All right, this is the final part of the reading of Hamlet, and then there are a couple talks that follow on the theme and much bigger things. We left off at Act 5, Scene 1, and let's pick it up around line 120, where Hamlet is asking the clown who's digging the grave, "Whose grave's this, sirrah?" Clown says, "Mine," and he starts singing, "O pit of clay, for to be made, for such a guest is meet." Hamlet says, "I think it be thine indeed, for thou liest in it." Clown says, "You lie out on it, sir, and therefore 'tis not yours. For my part, I do not lie in it, yet it's mine." Hamlet says, "Thou dost lie in it, to be in it, and say it is thine. 'Tis for the dead, not for the quick, therefore thou liest." Clown says, "'Tis a quick lie, sir. 'Twill away again from me to you." Hamlet tries all over again. "What man dost thou dig it for?" Clown says, "For no man, sir." Hamlet says, "For what woman then?" Clown says, "For none, neither." Hamlet says, "Who is to be buried in it?" The clown says, "One that was a woman, sir, but rest her soul, she's dead." Hamlet says, speaking to Horatio, "How absolute the knave is. We must speak by the card, or equivocation will undo us. By the Lord, Horatio, this 3 years I have took note of it, the age is grown so picked that the toe of the peasant comes near to the heel of the courtier. He galls his kib. How long hast thou been a grave maker?" The clown says, "Of all the days in the year. I came to it that day our last king, Hamlet, overcame Fortinbras." "How long is it since then?" "Cannot tell you that. Every fool can tell that it was that very day that young Hamlet was born, he that is mad and sent to England." Hamlet says, "Aye, marry, why was he sent to England?" The clown says, "Why? Because a was mad. A shall recover his wits there, or if a do not, 'tis no great matter there." Hamlet says, "Why?" "'Twill not be seen in him there. There the men are as mad as he." Hamlet says, "How came he mad?" The clown says, "Very strangely, they say." "How strangely?" The clown says, "Faith, e'en with losing his wits." And Hamlet says, "Upon what ground?" The clown says, "Why, here in Denmark. I have been sexton here, man and boy, 30 years. How long will a man lie in the earth ere he rot?" Clown says, "Faith, if a not be rotten before a die, as we have many porky courses nowadays that will scarce hold a laying in, a will last you some 8 year or 9 year. A tanner will last you 9 year. Hamlet says, "Why he more than another?" The clown says, "Why, sir, his hide is so tanned with his trade that it will keep out water a great while, and your water is a sore decayer of your whoreson dead body. Here's the skull now that hath lain you in the earth 23 years." Hamlet says, "Whose is it?" "A whoreson mad fellow's it was." "Who do you think it was?" Hamlet says, "I know not." Clown says, "A pestilence on him, for a mad rogue poured a flagon of Rhenish on my head once." "This same skull, sir?" "Yorick's skull, the king's gesture." Hamlet says, "This?" The clown says, "E'en that." And he says, let me see." He takes the skull and he says, Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning. Quite chapfallen? Now get you to my lady's chamber, and tell her, paint an inch thick to this favour, he must come. Make her laugh at that. Prithee, Horatio, tell me one thing. Horatio says, What's that, my lord? Hamlet says, Dost thou think Alexander looked of this fashioned in the earth? Horatio says, E'en so. And smelt so? Pah! Horatio says, E'en so, my lord. Hamlet, to what base uses we may return, Horatio? Why may not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander till it find it stopping a bunghole? 'Twere to consider too curiously to consider it so. No, faith, not a jot, but to follow him thither with modesty enough and likelihood to lead it to thus. Alexander died, Alexander was buried, Alexander returneth to dust, the dust is earth, of earth we make loam, and why of that loam whereto he was converted might they not stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that earth which kept the world in awe should patch a wall to expel the winter's flaw. But soft a while, here comes the king. At that point, the royal family comes in, and let's break it off there. Now, since the talk before this, I have been reading the passage over and over again where the death of Ophelia is described. And she's described wearing a crownlet made of different herbs and carrying a bunch of herbs and climbing a tree. And as she's climbing a tree, a branch breaks and she falls into the stream, and she floats downstream upheld by her dresses until they become saturated and she's pulled under and drowned. And there's nothing in that description that argues that there was suicide. And all of this talk about suicide, I just don't understand it. It may be a matter that the play was altered at the last minute, and maybe there was intended to be a suicide. Or maybe the suicide business was just put in to show the way that the nobles bend the law to their own desires and have her buried as a regular death when it may have been a suicide. So I don't understand this. I'm sure there are possibly other flaws and errors or something in Shakespeare. But that's enough of that. What we just read is about as good a banter as one can find in Shakespeare. The man really is absolute, the way he literally takes words and the way he wants his words to be taken. And then there's something that occurs in there that is really fascinating. It's a sign that Hamlet is sane and mature because he has the opportunity to quiz the gravedigger and find out what he and the people thinks of him. He does that a little bit, but only follows it a short ways before he is taken off on some deeper idea of the cycle of life through form. Now, most of us because of our vanity or because of our insecurity, we would want to hear as much as we could about ourselves. As a mature person that's sure in himself, that doesn't need to hear what other people think of him. In some cases, that kind of information that would come from others, it can be objective, especially if the person who is relating it is a perspicacious person and discerning of what he sees, but that's usually not the case. And usually the hearer of such information is not prepared for getting that kind of information without being overwhelmed. Because in our vanity we think a lot of ourselves, and we think that the world must also think so. And if there is something in there we don't like, we are mortified by it. Hamlet has observed and he studied his own behavior. He sees his motives, and he's been pretty impersonal about it. So he doesn't need an external testimony. He doesn't need that famous line from Bobby Burns, "Oh, would some God the gift he gie us as others see us," because he has the ability of getting outside of himself to do that very thing. Now, let's talk a little bit about the tragedy of this play. Almost every commentator on tragedy since Aristotle and the Greeks agrees that growth on the part of a hero, a tragic hero, is what marks the success of a tragedy. This is an unusual case. In this sense, Hamlet is magnificent as a tragic hero because he grows in many different ways, and he grows throughout the play. And that is very unusual, perhaps even unique. In almost all cases, the tragic hero or heroine grows after a horrible mistake. And Hamlet grows all along before he's even done any tragic deeds. In fact, it's hard to say what his tragic deeds are unless you're going to say that it is his unwillingness to do what needs to be done, that is his failing. It's a strange, tragic nature. The philosophy of tragedy is that we humans are fallen and we're in darkness and filled with vain desires and pride and egoism and all of that. And it is only when we have carried out our sins to their logical consequences, which are sometimes mortal, that we can see them for ourselves, for what they are. And only then can we start making corrections when we see what really is. For most of us, illness is the best carrying out of deeds of poor living to tragic consequences. Shakespeare in Hamlet seems to be saying that there's another way that we can grow as a tragic hero. And maybe it is the diffidence of Hamlet that is his tragic mistake, but it is that very diffidence that is the source of his growth. In teetering back and forth, should I not, is the ghost true or not true, in all of that he does a lot of self-examination. And that's exactly what Shakespeare seems to be saying. He's saying that by self-knowledge we can know the truth. We can know the truth of our own being. And in that we can see and accept our destiny at any time, even before the critical moment. We may still have difficult and unpleasant things to carry out, but we don't have to make colossal blind blunders to be growing in a tragic sense. This is what we're all aspiring to. This is initiate wisdom. We don't have to learn everything exclusively by trial and error. We can learn by insight and other higher faculties when we review the things that we have done, and when we look at our own motivation and cultivate an inner life in such a way that we see what is behind what we have done and what we have not done. And in doing so, one can come to fuller and greater waking consciousness. Now, Hamlet is probably not quite completely open in his inner vision, because he's not deliberately self-conscious in all situations. And he does things like blundering into the slaying of Polonius, which I don't know really is his tragic mistake. And he's not completely filled with spiritual resolution as a person who has suffered the consequences of a tragic mistake. He's still battling over all of this. Now, we realize that Hamlet's charge is to revenge his father's death, and that it is not a personal thing, it is not a religious thing, it is just that in so doing he would bring some kind of homeostasis of justice. It's a tough question. Is there such a thing as a just homicide? Is there such a thing as a just war? And I guess the only answer that really makes sense in that is that the answer is relative. It's relative to the individual or to the evolution. Now, Gandhi could do everything that he did, and he did it without perpetrating any violence. But how many people are Gandhi? Some people have to stand up and even be massacred, or stand up and overthrow what is unjust. If we look at ourselves, we're indeed in tragic darkness, and we don't make near the great tragic blunders that a lot of the tragic heroes do. That'll turn us around, but we do in our lives have opportunities from misdeeds that we have done, opportunities to make little steps forward. We are in a very slow inch-meal process of building toward these great moments where we can do great things that are the proof of our being. And we're in a stream of many causes and consequences, and in that stream we're often pretty blind. We don't have the conviction to accept the pummeling of injustice with love, and we fight against it. And so we continue in our sins because we don't have that strength that Hamlet has now, that he can accept things that are happening. Neither do we always have the faculties to prevent harm to others, which may require violence. If someone like a homicidal maniac is attacking someone like a mother with a child, at our state of development, it's a perfectly just thing to take that person out if we have to. But these are things that are changing in humanity. As this re-talk is being given, there is a great stir in the United States about police violence against people in society, and that very issue is coming up. Is it all right for those that have the power and the ability to be executioners? And people are not just accepting it as they had in the past. I doubt whether a planned homicide or a planned assassination is necessary. It has to be somebody who is really blind, perhaps insane in the true sense of insanity. But it's hard to say about these things what is a valid case and what isn't at our stage of evolution, even individual by individual, because we're talking about hypotheticals, and hypotheticals we just don't know. But if we look at the specific of the play, is the vengeful slaying of Claudius justifiable? Probably not by our standards, but that's the tragic lesson of Hamlet to learn. And it's also a part of the grand metaphor of the myth or the myths that are behind this play, which we hopefully will get into in the next talk or two. But back on topic, we can see progress or growth in one facet that is expressed in 3 different speeches. The first is between lines 91 and 114. Let me get to it here. Hamlet says, "Why, e'en so, and now my lady's worms chapless and knocked about the mazzard with a sexton spade. Here's fine revolution, and we had the trick to see it. Did these bones cost no more, the breeding, but to play at logets within? Mine ache to think on it." He's trying to think about the sanctity of the body. You know, here this was once a living person. Was this person living only for some clown like this to throw the bones about? All of this, at this point, Hamlet is almost morbid and cynical about it. It certainly feels that way about the dishonest ways of life before death, and there's some tacit implication of comparison to something intangible out of life that is worth something else or worth something more. Carrying on a little further, the second speech is at line 185 to 197, closer to where we have been reading. This is the Yorick statement. "Let me see," takes the skull of Yorick. "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He has borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment, that were wont to set the table a-roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning. Quite chapfallen? Now get you to my lady's chamber, and tell her, let her paint an inch thick, to this favour she must come. Make her laugh at that. Prithee, Horatio, tell me one thing." He's contemplating in this speech someone who he loved. He's not just talking about any anonymous person and whether any anonymous person deserves this kind of treatment in the grave. Being treated so grimly, and he even finds it abhorrent. He wants to upchuck. And he questions the futility and the losses of Yorick, which leads him to question historical immortality like that of Alexander. His greatness, the greatness of Alexander, his appearance, and then his loss. This is bringing it closer to home, because Yorick was a hero to him in childhood. The second speech has the same kind of world weariness and melancholy that we've seen all along. The third speech, which shows this line of development, is between 209 and 219. Hamlet says, no, faith not a jot, but to follow him thither with modesty enough and likelihood to lead it, as thus Alexander died. Alexander was buried. Alexander rendereth to dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam, and why of that loam whereto he was converted might they not stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that earth which kept the world in awe should patch a wall to expel the winter's flaw, but soft a while. So now he's carried this even further in this third speech. It's a radical change, but it still has that same ambiguity. First, he had considered the futility of schemes and scoundrels, lawyers and merchants and people like that. Then he considers the pathos of the loss of dear ones to him, as in the case of Yorick. And then he considers how the bodies of great Alexander or Caesar might end up stopping a barrel or a crack in a wall. Now, added to all of this development, which is clearly a development, there is a twist of cyclicity, the cycling and the recycling of matter. So some of the questioning he does is really a questioning of materialism, though it isn't put out that way. It's very subtle. When he talks about Caesar conquering the earth, he talks about Caesar being earth. That is, the body of Caesar conquering the earth and then conquered by earth. So, and in this, there is cyclicity again. The line of thought seems to be going in the same direction of ultimate futility. It's the same as the to be or not to be speech with its futility. But that's only considering it in earthly terms. It is this kind of questioning that does indeed cause us to question all of the material stuff and the value of things in this life compared to the intangibles, like compared to the love of Yorick. The skull means naught now. So in all of this, it's almost like Hamlet is thinking as he passes from the futility of a base life to a clear, dear, positive personal life, to the futility even of a grand life, of a Caesar or an Alexander. Now, like all things, this is a play. Even in our life, when we talk, our whole thought process is not carried out in the talk, and all of Hamlet's process is not visible to us either. And it's invisible, and we have to infer it. Now, if we look at these are not the musings of a mere melancholic, mundane man. He knows there's something more. So Hamlet has tasted in several ways, one seeing the ghost, and after that having other clairvoyant and intuitive presentments. He's not just a melancholic, mundane man. He's gotten beyond that. He has intuition, and he even reads minds. And he has knowledge of profound cultural cycles, which he ponders. And so these are not the patter of just a petty pessimist. A petty pessimist would put forth a little argument and it would be over and done, and it would be cut and dried. So the inference, or one of the inferences that I draw from this, is that all earthly experience for its own sake is meaningless. That there is a finality to earth things, and greater things, like the love of Yorick, still live. They live in the memory of Hamlet, but the merely earthly existence for its own sake is meaningless relative to something higher, something greater, something that he senses but not necessarily can see yet. It's still a feeling. So this whole passage, or this progression through these three passages, is something like Solomon saying, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, while contemplating God and looking at this little world. So this passage, as we said earlier, also seems to say that the face of our petty existence, even in the great to be or not to be, is ultimately existential. That the being is not determined by material being or not being. It is determined by an existential quality within the being or not being. Now, since Hamlet is aware of life after death and has a greater conception of things, the recycling of matter also seems to imply, or meant to imply, spiritual recycling, though it would be taking things way too far that from any of these speeches one could talk about the cycle of rebirth or anything like that, but clearly he is questioning something like that. It's good if you don't say too much and put forth a thesis in such a way that it's simple and direct, and don't allow someone to think and come to the conclusion of that thesis on their own. You can ask the question, is that spiritual cyclicity hinted at in Shakespeare? And even if it's stretched, the answer that I come up with is maybe. But it's asking an awful lot. If it produces thought on higher things, that's fine. That might even be enough. And such thought doesn't need the proving or the approbation or the evidence of Shakespeare or anyone else to be of value in doing. It is enough to enjoy the higher thought and where it takes us with truth. It is enough to enjoy Shakespeare. We don't need to stretch him in a Procrustean bed to say things we would like him to say. That's not quite right. It only weakens one's position if we have to make statements that are as outrageous as that. It's insecure if we have to say this is what it meant, and when the evidence isn't there. And I guess what we're trying to get at is we're saying that Shakespeare, we're not using Shakespeare to validate mysticism. We're using Shakespeare as a springboard into a wide variety of mystical topics that come up in the plays and in the themes of the plays and how they're constructed. If anything, we're using mysticism to validate Shakespeare and not Shakespeare to validate mysticism. What happens then is that the royal burial party arrives, and Hamlet and Horatio step aside, and a doctor, which is a name that they give to people of great learning, such as Meister Eckhart was called a doctor, speaks of her suspicious death, and that's that same death we mentioned earlier. You know, it isn't clear that she suicided. I wouldn't say she suicided from the description that's given us. And the doctor says that the burial that she should have had as a suicide has been overruled. Laertes at this point asks what's next, and is told nothing more. Even a requiem would be a profane thing to do for suicide. Laertes says to put her in the earth, mentioning his sister, and Hamlet finally figures out who it is that is being buried. The queen says, farewell. She starts scattering flowers over the voice in the grave and voicing her regret that Ophelia never became her daughter-in-law. Laertes curses who he thinks is responsible, and he leaps into the grave. And he bids them to throw dirt on the living and the dead, with lovely classical mythical references to Mount Ossa. It is it's the myth of Ossa and Pellon, which are two mountains in Greece, and somebody in vain endeavor tried to pile Mount Ossa on top of Mount Pellon, or vice versa, in order to reach into heaven. It's a symbol of vain endeavor. At this time, Hamlet steps forth and announces himself, and let's read some of that. There is a wrestling between Laertes and Hamlet, and Laertes wants to strangle him, but he's warned off, and they are pulled apart. Hamlet says he will fight him on the matter. And when the queen asks what matter, he proclaims here his love that was hidden before, and the amazing intensity of his emotions in this love. It's quite a remarkable section of the scene. Let's read from 256 to the end of the scene. Hamlet, coming forth, says, "What is he whose grief bears such an emphasis, whose phrase of sorrow conjures the wandering stars and makes them stand like wonder-wound hearers? This is I, Hamlet the Dane." Wow, what a magnificent strength. Laertes says, "The devil take thy soul." Hamlet says, "Thou prayest not well. I prithee take thy fingers from my throat. For though I am not splenitive and rash, yet I have in me something dangerous, which let thy wisdom fear. Hold off thy hand." The king says, "Pluck them asunder." The queen says, "Hamlet, Hamlet, all gentlemen." Horatio says, "My good lord, be quiet." Hamlet then says, they're pulled apart at this point, "Why, I will fight with him upon this theme until my eyelids will no longer wag." Oh, my son, what theme? Here comes Hamlet now. Wow. "I loved Ophelia." 3 words, it's enough for it. 40,000 brothers could not with all their quantity of love make up my sum. What wilt thou do for her? The king says, "Oh, he is mad, Laertes." Queen says, "For love of God, forbear him." Hamlet says, swoons, "Show me what thou do. Would weep, would fight, would fast, would hear thyself, would drink up Isel, eat a crocodile? I'll do it. Thou dost come here to whine, to outface me with leaping in her grave, be buried with her, and so will I. If thou prate of mountains, let them throw millions of acres on us till our ground singeing his pate against the burning zone make Ossa like a wart. Nay, and thou art mouth, I'll rant as well as thou." The queen says, "This is mere madness, and thus a while the fit will work on him, anon as patient as the faithful dove. When that her golden couplets are disclosed, his silence will sit drooping." Hamlet says, "Hear you, sir, what is the reason that you use me thus? I loved you ever. But it is no matter. Let Hercules do what he may. The cat will mew and dog will have his day. And the king says, I pray thee, good Horatio, wait upon him. And then to Laertes he says, strengthen your patience in our last night's speech. We'll put the matter to present push. Good Gertrude, set some watch over your son. This grave shall have a living monument, an hour of quite shortly shall we see. Till then, in patience our proceeding be. Again, those rhyming things to indicate a change of things, the end of the scene. This little vignette gives us a very important, greater insight in the complicated psychology of Hamlet. When we looked at Winter's Tale, we saw that Leontes was also complicated. And he was complicated for the same reason that Hamlet is, and that reason is introversion. In introversion, things get complicated very quickly. But beyond that, the similarities are few, because not all introversive states are the same. Leontes was an emotional type, and his emotions were not developed. They were even insecure and jealous and immature, and he was a feeling introvert, and his feelings fed on themselves. He didn't have any great externalization. Hamlet, on the other hand, is a thinking type, and a very sophisticated one at that. A clear-thinking introvert. I guess you have to some extent be introversive to have visions of the inner world. That's what mysticism is all about. Moreover, Hamlet is generally a well-developed human being. We can see that he has an acute intuition. He has a capable intuition to be able to read minds, and we can now see that he has an intense emotional nature, a love nature that is quite strong. However, his love has to be suppressed, even violently suppressed, not repressed, but suppressed. And the suppressing agency was his mind. Having all these different facets of character developed is the hallmark of a very advanced person. It's the kind of person who would be on the brink of initiation. Having the intense love exposed gives us a much clearer picture of his psyche, especially the troublesome part of it, his melancholy and depression. First, we see that he has worn out the uses of the world. He can still see the beauties of the physical world, but they're old hat to him. That's world weariness. He's sort of like Faust, who has great knowledge and rare appreciation of beauty, but that's not enough anymore. He needs to go beyond. Then there's the matter of inequality between thought and emotion in his character. At first it seemed almost like he was emotionally mute, that he was relatively emotionless. And now we know better that he not only has emotions, but that they are intense emotions. So Polonius was right, but for altogether different reasons. But that's too much of a distraction for the moment. Now it seems in his emotions that he's not as strong as his thoughts, or his thoughts would have not been able to coop them up, would not have been able to suppress them. If the emotions were as strong or stronger than the mind, he would have acted on them, because that's the nature of emotions. They are motive. That's where the emotion comes from. So he's capable of repressing it, and in that repression, that is where the That is where the depression comes in. I just said repression, but it's not clear whether it's suppression or repression to some extent, because he does get into trouble psychologically in some ways and says that he's not always in control of his mind. That part is depression. But the volitional doing of it with regard to his feelings for Ophelia are clearly suppression. So we have a very, very clear character development here. Now, anytime the head exceeds the heart, there's going to be some degree of depression, because the mind will probably be cold and grim, because that's the only way that it can hold the heart down. So now we can see two different shades of melancholy in him. There is the matter of repressed or suppressed anger or desire, and from his sarcasm, we got a hint of his own anger, especially when he talked about, in the very first scene, where he talked about the thrift in using the food from the funeral to serve the wedding party. From his own statement, we can see that we know of his cowardice and his lack of initiative that has been sicklied by his thoughts. So it's like he spent all of his thoughts in suppressing desires, and he recognizes the danger in that, how it makes life dull. It blunts it. Now, psychiatrists, some schools of psychiatry especially, find that suppressed or depressed anger results in depression. So we see yet another agency of depression or melancholy, and get yet another side of his character, a gnawing, self-chastening side of depression. Finally, we see his difficulty in yet another way. The world and sensate values are not enough. His feelings, though intense compared to those of others, are no match for his mind. And the mind, as strong as it is and used appropriately, is the suppressing agency, or inappropriately, however you want to look at it. It is not equal to the things of his intuition, because his intuition, he sees things beyond what his thought can apperceive. And in his thought, he begins with, after his intuitions, he begins a much deeper, more pondersome thing that's coming out in all of his cycle speeches. So these are spiritual philosophies. And we see those developing very early on, when in the scene with the ghost, he says there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than your philosophy knows. So he can be aware of them, but he can't soar to them yet. He can't abandon himself in the personal way of self-protection and wanting to do the right thing, always in a neurotic sort of way. And he can't be filled by the higher kind of enthusiasm, just like he can't be filled by the love that would fulfill his whole character. Now, nobody's going to do it for him. He's far enough along that he knows that he has to do it on his own. Thus, if he doesn't penetrate more deeply into the spirit within, he must remain depressed, because any time we do not apply ourselves to something more deeply, we can't get behind the repression to lift off the repressing agency. So no matter at what level we look at him or what angle we look at him, the result is depression or melancholy. You might even say that this is the whole tragic business. The tragedy is not a grief, though he has plenty of grief. The tragedy is the melancholy. So we see a lot more in the nature of Hamlet and his depression. It is the melancholy of gross self-dissatisfaction, unable to penetrate the spiritual realms and act out from them. Though we have a few instances that we see that he could do it to some extent, especially with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. The reason for this is because he is somewhat egoistically self-preoccupied and caught up in the thinking of it. His egoism is not crude or blatant, but he certainly is too aware of his sarcasms and how he is trapped in his own clevernesses, and it's sort of a matter of the wise shall be captured in their folly, to paraphrase the Bible. So we noted 4 at least different forms and sources of melancholy. In fact, this play, in this play, the character of Hamlet is a tour de force of studying melancholy and depression. Then there's the question of suppressed love, which is the real puzzler. Why would anyone suppress love? Not sex, but love. Why would anyone suppress love? It does happen, and it happens frequently. And often, suppression of love is the cause of much shyness. We're shy or bashful about the things we hold dear and revere so deeply and love so dearly that we don't know how or don't want to express them. We feel almost like keeping them inward. We're keeping them sacred, not realizing that if we could bring them out, that we'd have even greater and deeper flows of love within us, but, we're not perfect human beings yet. You might say a person who has no shyness or no emotional reticence is a person who has nothing that they hold sacred. Such a person is shallow, a surface person, and everything's all outside. Now, Hamlet can talk the body talk with Ophelia, but that masks how he really feels. And he may even be using that to test how she feels. I am such an individual as a human being that I have done that from time to time. That Scorpio kind of probing, using innuendo to be the probe. There's another side to it. Anytime we express love, say in art, the expression, especially a cultural expression, never lives up to the inner experience. It cannot, because it's been diluted and it's been hardened and it has been dulled in the expression. Nonetheless, it's extremely unwise to suppress love, to not express it. Because if we don't express love, the love will never get deeper. It is when our expressions are inadequate that we dig deeper into ourselves to learn more and better. It's another one of those cycles of externalization. What happens is, if we do suppress it and do not express it, it stagnates, and it proliferates, and it deteriorates, and falls back into a shallow fantasy, the kind of fantasy that Leontes had in Winter's Tale. So shyness and suppression of love are not healthy. One usually suppresses love because one almost worships the object of the love and identifies with it. because it is their love. And when you start putting the possessive on love, that's when problems come in. Love belongs to no one. It is beyond attachment. It is beyond identification. We should consider ourselves extremely lucky to just be able to express it. Now, Hamlet shows few signs of personal fantasy and only a small amount of shyness. We have to look, therefore, elsewhere for the source of repressed love. My guess is that it's a matter of exigency. Ironically, the same kind of exigency which had the funeral leftovers be used for the marriage. Hamlet is developed in many ways and on many levels of his being, but he's still human, and he can't do everything, and must do what is important. Having the unctuous charge from the ghost of his father, with the heart let loose, meaning to say that you have only so much time to do this, he has to act on the things that are most important. It's a matter of priorities. You can't do everything. And so he has to do things quickly, and there's not enough time to carry out a romance, especially because a romance involves somebody else, and there's all kinds of dilatory indecision in romances. Besides, in his own admission, his occupation with greater and higher matters has made him indifferent to the attraction to either woman or man. And though he may deeply love Ophelia, it would have likely have been a sexless kind of marriage, because he's gotten beyond being merely a physical person. And that's a kind of a problematic thing to have. I love you, honey, but we are not going to bed. And for young people who want to have babies, or that is the only way that they can express their desires, that's a difficult thing. It probably has a lot to do with the huge repressed sexuality that she had, and singing those bawdy songs until it finally got to be too much for her. So there is a lot more to those words when he says in conversation with her, "Get thee to a nunnery." It indicates that he can read what her emotionality is and what her desire is. And both uses of nunnery are good uses. One is, he's saying, get thee to a brothel. He's saying, work this self out of you. You can't have those kinds of sexual desires and let them build up inside of you. On the other hand, the other meaning is true also, a nunnery meaning a nunnery, because it is only with the higher thought, with the higher emotion, the unattached love, that one can get beyond sexuality. There are a lot of mystical students that have ended up with severe psychological problems because they tried to suppress the sexual drive and the sexual energy unsuccessfully, and it was unsuccessful because they did not cultivate the higher emotions. Even though love and the various flavors of love that we as spiritual students try to share with others, even though that seems to be very subtle and very gentle, that's a very powerful force. And most people, have to have anger or things like that before they know that they feel something. Whereas if a person can cultivate those higher kinds of things, that's the way they can deal with the sexual energy. As we saw, the scene ends with Claudius calming Laertes down and by telling him that Hamlet has set the trap that they were going to set for them. Now, scene 2 opens up with a lovely scene by Hamlet in praise of action. Let's read that. The man who has been inactive understands it. Speaking to Horatio, he says, "Sir, in my heart there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. Methought I lay worse than the mutinies in the bilboes. Rashly, and praised be rashness for it, let us know our indiscretion sometimes serves us well. When our deep plots do pall, and that should learn us, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will." One of my favorite lines in all of Shakespeare. I repeat it for that reason. There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. So if we do set something in motion, I think what he's saying here is something that I can see now as an older person. I used to think about the rashness and passion of youth and how people got themselves into trouble so quickly. And now I can see, as Hamlet does, that might be a good thing. If a person were prematurely thoughtful about things, a lot of people wouldn't get married and have children, because they'd look at all the drawbacks and they would look at how unprepared they were. They would all become little Hamlets. But because youth does get carried away by passion and acts on things, they find themselves married with several kids before they know what hit them, and then they have to live out their life with their responsibilities. But it's good that we have those passions, or those things might never have been accomplished, and a life would have been a pretty insipid kind of life. All right, let's see. For Hamlet, rash action is indeed a blessing, and something, it's a step forward for him. And so we can see there is a divinity that will bring goodness out of our deeds, even though we rough hew our destiny with our crude nature. Hamlet goes on to tell how while on the ship he found a note from Claudius to England telling the English to execute Hamlet. He tells how he changed it to read that they should execute the bearers, and he still had his father's ring, and he sealed the message back up and pressed the wax with the seal of his father's ring, and that is the end of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And then, now that things are coming out in the open, he proceeds to tell Horatio of the murder that Claudius had perpetrated, and the intent that he has on Hamlet's life, and how he intends to pay back with his own life. Horatio says, there's little time before a courier shall return from England, probably thinking that Hamlet wants to raise an army and go against the king. And Hamlet says, a little of time as there is, it will be enough. This is another case again where he has anticipated many options, and he looks ahead and he's ready for anything. He then begins to both feel bad about Laertes, whose vengeance is not unlike his own. And this is really a step forward. This is a step beyond egoism. When you can see that somebody's suffering through the same thing you are suffering, it's you're not wrapped up in yourself egoistically. It's, the definition of love is to see things in terms of other people rather than yourself. Now we're going to do something very tedious. At this point, they are interrupted by a courier named Osric, who is another sycophant that is sent by the king. And Hamlet treats him the same way that he treated Rosencrantz and Guildenstern earlier. It's with flowery hyperbole, and even though Osric is merely trying to announce the duel, and tells Hamlet and Laertes what the wagers are on it, Hamlet stretches it all out. Let's read that. And mind you, we're reading this very tedious, long passage for a reason. All right. Osric says, "Your lordship is right welcome back to Denmark." And Hamlet says, "I thank you, sir." And aside he says, "Dost thou know this water fly?" Horatio says, "No, my good lord." Hamlet says, "Thy state is more gracious, for 'tis a vice to know him. He hath much land and fertile. Let a beast be lord of beasts, and his crib shall stand at the king's mess. 'Tis enough, but I say spacious in the possession of dirt." Osric says, "Sweet lord, your lordship were at leisure. If your lordship were at leisure, I should impart to you a thing from his majesty." Hamlet says, "I will receive it with all diligence of spirit. Put your bonnet to his right use. 'Tis for the head." Osric says, "I thank your lordship. It is very hot." Hamlet says, "No, believe me, 'tis very cold. The wind is northerly." Osric says, "It is indifferent cold, my lord, indeed." Well, a sycophant talking. Hamlet says, "But yet methinks it is very sultry and hot for any complexion." Osric says, "Exceedingly, my lord, it is very sultry, as 'twere, I cannot tell how. But my lord, his majesty bade me to signify you that it was laid a great wager on your head. Sir, this is the matter." Hamlet says, "I beseech you, remember." And he tries to get him to put his hat on. "Nay, good my lord, for my ease in good faith, sir, is newly come to court. Laertes, believe me, an absolute gentleman, full of most excellent differences, of very soft society and great showing. Indeed, to speak feelingly of him, he is the card or calendar of gentry, for you shall find him in the continent of what part a gentleman would see." Hamlet says, "Sir, this definement suffers no perdition in you, though I know. To divide him inventorially would doozy the arithmetic of memory, and yet but yaw neither in respect of his quick sale. But in the verity of extolment I take him to be a soul of great article, and his infusion of such dearth and rareness as to make true diction of him. His semblance is his mirror, and who else would trace him? His umbrage, nothing more." He's speaking in very high-blown language, and Osric, who probably doesn't get it, says, "Your lordship speaks most infallibly of him." Hamlet says, "The concernancy, sir, why do we wrap this gentleman in our rawer breath?" Osric says, "Sir, is it not possible to understand in another tongue? You will to it, sir, really." Hamlet says, "What imports the nomination of this gentleman?" Osric says, "Of Laertes?" Horatio says to Hamlet, "His purse is empty already. All his golden words are spent." Hamlet says, "Of him, sir." "Of him, sir." Osric says, "I know you are not ignorant." Hamlet says, "I would you did, sir. Yet in faith, if you did, it would not much approve me." "Well, sir." Osric tries to start again. "You are not ignorant of what excellence Laertes is." Hamlet says, "I dare not confess that, lest I should compare him in excellence. But to know a man well were to know himself." Wow, what a line, huh? "But to know a man well were to know himself. I mean, sir, for his weapon. But in imputation laid on him by them in his meed, He's unfellowed. What's his weapon? Rapier and dagger. That's two of his weapons, but well, Osric, Hamlet's being as absolute as the gravedigger was earlier. Osric says, the king, sir, has wagered with him 6 Barbary horses, against which he has impawned, as I take it, 6 French rapiers and poignards, with their assigns as girdle hangers and so on. 3 of the carriages in response are very dear to fancy, very responsive to the hilts, most delicate carriages, and of very liberal conceit. Hamlet says, what call you the carriages? Horatius says to Hamlet, I knew you must be edified by the margent as you had done. Osric says, the carriages, sir, are the hangers. Hamlet says, the phrase would be more germane to the matter if we could carry a cannon by our sides. It might be hangers till then. But on, 6 Barbary horses against 6 French swords with their assigns and 3 liberal conceited carriages. That's the French bet against the Danish. Why is this all impawned, as you call it? Osric says, the king, sir, hath laid, sir, that in a dozen passes between yourself and him he shall not exceed you 3 hits. He hath laid on him 12 for 9, and it would come to immediate trial if your lordship would vouchsafe the answer. Hamlet says, how if I answer no? Osric said, I mean, my lord, the opposite of your person on trial. Hamlet says, sir, I will walk here in the hall. If it please his majesty, it is the breathing time of day with me. Let the foils be brought, the gentleman willing, and the king hold his purpose. I will win for him, and I can, if not, I will gain nothing but my shame and the odd hits. Osric says, shall I deliver it e'en so? To this effect, sir, after what flourish your nature will. Osric says, I command my duty to your lordship. Hamlet says, yours, and Osric goes, and Hamlet continues on, well, he does to commend himself, there are no tongues else for its turn. Horatio says, the lapwing runs away with the shell on his head. Let's see here. Oh, we got a ways to go yet. Let's see where we are. Well, let's just pause there. Now, this has been a very tedious thing. Extremely tedious. There's a lot of lovely sarcasm, and there's hyperbole that is hilarious, and we get one line of really rare insight about a man knowing himself to know others. But this passage, just as it is peculiar. It's not peculiar for its sarcasm or for its difficult language, because he does use difficult language to throw the man off, but because it exists at all. This is a long and tedious and possibly pointless exchange. If we think about it, the play is already very long, too long for most people's tastes. And there have been other side trips, such as the side trip with the players, that seemed to be of no purpose to the development of the story. We get no new information. We don't know any better about sycophantry. And the sarcasm, a lot of it is just a repeat of what has been before. It seems to be a waste of words and a waste of time. But then there comes one line at 188. Horatio says it. This lapwing runs away with the shell on his head. Now, at this point, if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking that the speaker is crazy to think that that is an important line. A lapwing is a variety of a plover. Here, among country folk, we call them killdeers because they make a sound in their song that is like killdeer, killdeer, killdeer. The lapwing nests on the ground, and because of that, it is vulnerable to predators. It's a pretty large bird, bigger than a robin. And if a predator comes around, such as a fox or something like that, if it approaches the nest, the mother is a little bit away from the nest, and she'll feign a broken wing. She'll play act as though she has a broken wing, and she'll thrash around on the ground. The fox or the predator tries to capture her, and in just the last second of it, she evades it. And she moves this short distance off as if it was just a lucky thing that she was able to get away, and then she repeats the whole performance all over. And this will continue until the predator is removed at what she thinks is a safe distance from the nest, and then she'll fly away. Now, this kind of distraction is a ruse similar to prestidigitation. Prestidigitation is what we call sleight of hand. And prestidigitation, which literally means fast-handed, was used by true magicians. One of the problems with doing healing or some kind of true magic is to get the person to open their consciousness. And if you do something that they find really remarkable, their mouth will be ajar and agog, and they'll be looking at that. So what happened is that magical healers would do sleight of hand tricks because they didn't want to waste the precious spiritual energy on doing real magic before the person, and a person would get an open consciousness, and then with the open consciousness, the spiritual energy could be projected in for healing. That's a crude way of saying it, but that's what it is. Now, since the times of the Greeks, and maybe even before then, the lapwing has been symbolical of a distraction to protect the secrets of mystery wisdom. So it's a semi-open secret, which is an announcement to the true seeker to know that something secret is going on here. So any time that you encounter the lapwing, it's a time to be looking as a mystery student for something greater and something deeper. I think Shakespeare uses it, I know of two instances for certain, but I think there's a third time that he uses it also, but my memory is not real good on that. So I suspect that somewhere in this very tedious passage that we have just read, there is something possibly encoded. And with all of that complicated verbiage, especially that of Hamlet, there's room for it. However, since I, the speaker, am not an initiate, I don't have access to readily seeing what is encoded. I suppose with sufficient will and soul power and intuition, one could get into that, but it would take an awful lot of work for ordinary people like ourselves to dig into it. I know it's a worthwhile occupation if you'd like to do it. At any rate, a lord announces the coming of the king and the queen and says the queen bids him to be nice and courteous to Laertes, and Hamlet says he will. And a very interesting and important conversation occurs between Hamlet and Horatio. Even more interesting than when he tells him the whole story of the murder and all. It's very short. Let's read it. It's between lines 210 and 225. Horatio says, "You will lose this wager, my lord." Hamlet says, "I think not so. Since he went into France, I have been in continual practice. I shall win at the odds, but thou wouldst not think how ill all's here about my heart, but it is no matter." "Nay, good my lord," Hamlet interrupts him, saying, "It is but foolery, but it is of such a kind of gain-giving as would perhaps trouble a woman." Horatio says, "If your mind dislike anything, obey it," about the hesitancy that Hamlet is expressing. "I will forestall their repair hither, and say you are not fit." Hamlet says, "Not a whit. We defy augury. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow," a direct reference to the Bible. "Then, if it be now, 'tis not to come, it will not, if it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is the all. Since no man hath aught he leaves knows, what is it to leave betimes? Let it be." This is probably, again, one of those extremely short statements that I think for the candidate for initiation or the modern spiritual seeker, that one line, 4 words, the readiness is the all. The readiness is the all. To be ready for anything and everything. We tend to be mental people, and as mental people we try to plan for this contingency and that contingency, but you can't do that with life. Life is much too big, and especially if you're being put to an initiate trial where you're going to be, the very weakness of your soul is going to be bared through a trial to see if you are ready for initiation. The readiness is indeed the all. It's a really important line. All right. It's clear that Hamlet has a presentiment that things are not going well for him, that death is imminent, and he doesn't mean just losing this fencing match. It's difficult to have a knowledge of your own fate or your own doom. Most people would knuckle under to it. They would collapse before it. And I've worked now 50 years with astrology, and I have encountered many people wanting to know what's going to happen to me. And you know immediately when they ask the question, there's so much insecurity that if you told them, they would not be up to it. This is why the modern way is to be ready for anything. if we have equipoise in ourselves, if we are listening for the intuition, no matter what happens, we'll be ready. We're talking about self-knowing. We're talking about ripe destiny. And Hamlet assumes or knows that his destiny is coming ripe, that his hour is ready, and this is the time. This is why the speech, the readiness is the all. There is that poem that Max Heindel liked, one ship sails east and one sails west with the self-same winds that blow. 'Tis the set of the sail and not the gale which determines the way they go. As the winds of the sea are the ways of fate, as we voyage along through life, it is the act of the soul that determines the goal and not the calm or strife. The readiness is the all. The readiness is the all. That's really modern mysticism. All right, he knows what's right and ripe. And at this point, the royal party enters and everything is set up for the duel, the fencing. Before it all begins, Hamlet apologizes to Laertes, but says that it was his madness that offended. Laertes says he accepts the apology, but will not be reconciled until revenged and his name is cleared. He rests it all on his name, and the name is the personal identifier. We have the Father, the Divine Spirit, which is the meaning. We have the Word, or the Life Spirit, which is the vehicle of carrying out the meaning, and then we have the name, the human spirit, the individual. This shows us exactly where Laertes is. He's stuck in that world of the name. So let's read a little here, 227 to 254. The king says, "Come, Hamlet, come and take this hand from me." Hamlet says, "Give me your pardon, sir. I have done you wrong." This is the apology. "But pardon it as you are a gentleman. This presence knows, and you must needs have heard, how I am punished with a sore distraction. What have I done that might your nature, honor, and exception roughly awake? I proclaim here was madness." Was it Hamlet wronged Laertes? Never Hamlet. If Hamlet from himself be ta'en away, and when he's not himself does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it. Who does it then? His madness. If it be so, Hamlet is of the faction that is wronged. His of the faction that is wronged. His madness is poor Hamlet's enemy. Sir, in this audience let my disclaiming from an evil purpose free me so far in your generous thoughts that I have shot my arrow o'er the house and hurt my brother. Hamlet says, Laertes says, I'm satisfied in nature, and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's enough. This is getting to be long again, and I don't want it to be that long. But I enjoy this so much that I get going, and even if I'm talking to an audience that is not physically in front of me, it's still enjoyable. The things that Shakespeare points us to are beautiful things, the thing we should occupy our consciousness with. Now, this passage that we've just read is the most perplexing and troublesome passage in the entire play. I'm not sure that I understand it, the apology of Hamlet, but I will share some thoughts on it, and they're not final like anything is not final. The first time I read this it reminded me of a line from the play Medea by Euripides. And in that play there is the following line: "It was not I, but my tongue that lied." And I must have read that line many years ago, maybe 40 years, and I don't have a prodigious memory, but it has never left my mind because of the repulsion I felt on reading it. That speech is the antithesis of what we're trying to do spiritually. This appears like Hamlet is shirking his responsibility and his destiny. And what he's saying in that speech, "It was not I, but my madness that slew Polonius." What makes this all the more perplexing is that he said it outright that he was feigning madness, and gives evidence of that all along throughout the play. Now, earlier and several times since then, we've noted that to feign insanity is very dicey, because there is that allure to get into it. It's almost like John Keats's poem Ode to Melancholy, which he describes some of the beauty in melancholy that almost makes you want to go into melancholy, no matter whether it be dangerous or not. And feigning insanity can be like that. So it seems pertinent to ask the question, what is Hamlet doing in this speech? It was not I, but my insanity that did the slaying. Basically, what does this speech mean? Now, I can think of several reasons to answer that question, or at least the first part of it, because I've thought about it a lot. And the first is that it might just be hoopla. In sports events, you always try to get your opponent a little bit off guard. I can remember this in the early days of Muhammad Ali. He put all of his opponents off guard in this very way. Now, at first this seems beneath his character, but that's what he's been doing all along. He's been putting people off by feigning madness. And if the odds are what they are, that Laertes is as good as he is, using a little hoopla is a valid thing to do. Second possible meaning of this, it might be that he's trying to befriend Laertes and win him over, which is why Laertes responds as he does. Yes, I accept your apology, but I still want my vengeance. This is not far-fetched either, because this is exactly what Hamlet said he would do. Back at line 77, he says, "I'll court his favors." Third potential meaning of this is that the outburst over the death of Ophelia has opened the floodgates. His emotions are now pouring out, and he can no longer close them, and he no doubt sees the problems with trying to hold your emotions pent up. And at the same time, he's now sure of himself, because he knows he's going to fulfill his mission. He knows his time has come. So he's in a flow of love and in a flow of emotion, and everything is flowing out of it. It is everything that has been since the time of his madness or apparent madness. Now, this is surely the deepest of these three possible answers, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They might all three be true at the same time, and there may be others beyond it. But it requires a lot of work to answer the second part of this. What does this speech mean? Obviously, we can't interpret insane or insanity as meaning incapable of understanding or concluding truth, though it is certainly a life that is apart and different from everyone else. if we assume this, we find ourselves in the clutch of within deep logic is called Bertrand Russell's paradox. If we accept Hamlet when he says that he is incapable of concluding the truth, then we're in the paradoxical position that we must disregard his statement when he says he's incapable of the truth. The statement in itself voids itself if you accept it as being true. It's like taking a sheet of paper and on one side of it writing the statement, on the other side of this paper is false, and then you turn it over and the statement on the other side of this statement is true. It's a paradox. It's called the Russell's paradox. So if we say that Hamlet, if we accept him and say that he's correct and true in saying that, then we have to automatically disregard it. That's really very clever. If you're wanting to bamboozle someone, if you're wanting to really get to them psychologically, it's a clever thing to do. On the other hand, if we disregard what Hamlet is saying as crazy talk, which is what most psychiatrists would do, we find ourselves in the uncomfortable position of Osric or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, thinking something is crazy, coming from someone who has until now a perfect record of amazing insight and rare intelligence and wit in his speeches. So we don't, it's tough. What he does mean is described best in lines 235 to 239. Heaven, make thee free of it. I will follow thee. This is when, I'm sorry, I'm at 333. 235, 239. If Hamlet from himself be ta'en away, and when he's not himself does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it not. Who does it then? His madness, if it be so. Hamlet is of the faction that is wronged. He's describing his insanity. What he's actually describing is an intermittent insanity. And we can see that though there's great psychological insight in the character of Hamlet, there's not consistency. There's times when he does seem insane, and there seem to be times when he is feigning insanity. And he's struggling. It's a spiritual life and death struggle that he has. He's struggling with a lower nature inside of himself, which he knows isn't him. And he's calling that a thing. He's calling that an insanity. It's an insanity because it doesn't have the spirit within it. It is like any other entity in the inner world. It doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have a conscience or anything like that. It's very doubtful that there's an entity outside of him that he's struggling with. Yes, he's seen his father a few times, but there's no evidence to say that that's the source of his problems. However, there's plenty of evidence of his fighting himself in himself, and how using the mind has sickled his personality. It has made him unwilling to do things. So he's obviously struggling with his own nature as any aspirant or any candidate for initiation must do. And since one of the names for initiation, with the leaving of the body and all, it's called the little death. So this is indeed a life and death struggle. And very often this happens to people who try for initiation before they're ready. They struggle with the lower nature in the form of the dweller on the threshold, and they are overcome. And all of the personal things are taken away, and the spirit stands there naked, and it no longer has its vehicles to work with. This is what is sometimes referred to as eternal damnation. Max Heindel describes it very well, as does Bulwer Lytton. The difference between ourselves and Hamlet is that he has advanced to the point where this is now critical. This is, if it gets out of hand, it's going to be doing murders and things like that. Now, like ourselves, we all do things we don't want to do. In the struggle, Hamlet himself has not always been in control. There have been lapses and discontinuities in his consciousness and all of that sort of thing. So it's not really incorrect to describe that lower nature, that it doesn't have doesn't have the spirit in control of it, is to call it his madness. It's the same kind of struggle that St. Paul had when he says, that which I would not, that do I, and that which I do, I would not. And he talks about it as an evil inside of himself, and if he can call it as an evil, it's just as easy to call it a madness. Now, no matter what, there is a terrible irony if this is what he means. This means that to fulfill his apparent destiny, he has to kill Claudius. That's very hard to take in some regards. Stated in other words, it means he has to be willing to do anything in the service of the Spirit. It's very hard conceiving the Spirit asking anyone to kill, but it is conceivable. We have history of initiates having to do that same thing. Max Heindel tells us that the Knights of the Round Table were initiates, and they certainly did their share of killing. And we have the case in the Bible where Abraham was to kill his child. So it's a real crucial trial. I don't know how literally we can take it, but this is, when you're at that great moment of truth, it's crucial, which means of the cross. It's not surprising, if we think of it this way, that he should agonize it and try the Spirit as much as he does. Because this is you're being asked to do something really big here. Personally, I believe that the Spirit within asks us to live and to serve life. But I also believe that any trial is possible, especially if we recall Abraham or Agamemnon with his daughter Iphigenia. It's possible, but I suspect that the ultimate and unusual trial is not meant to shake us up, not only meant to shake us up and test our faith. It also serves in a much larger sense, which we're going to talk about in one of the next talks. Anyway, things are set up, and they prepare defense, and the odds that are that if we do the arithmetic in the course of 12 hits, if he gets as many as 5 of 12 hits, he wins, because with 4 or less hits, we're talking about Hamlet here, he loses. This means that if he gets 5 hits, that means Laertes can get hit 7 times. And this is an interesting set of numbers, 5, 7, 12. We find them throughout culture. We find them everywhere. We find the 7 manifest globes and the 5 dark globes. We find the 7 natural keys and the 5 sharps or flats on the keyboard. What we're talking about here is something, we can't possibly go into it now. And because it's way big, it's a cosmological proportion and too much of a diversion. But at any rate, they fence. And Hamlet wins the first 2 hits. He's ahead 2-0, so he's really ahead of the whole business. The queen sees that Hamlet is out of shape and a little short of breath, and she wipes his brow for him. And he's really gotten to her. She's changed a lot. And then she drinks of the poisoned cup that was meant to be for Hamlet in case Hamlet did in some way win the whole business. In the fray, the swords are dropped and they are exchanged, and both are wounded by the poison tip, both Laertes and Hamlet. The queen falls, and Laertes blurts out his own death by his own treachery. The queen dies shouting that she has been poisoned. Laertes falls and tells Hamlet he is doomed by the sword in his hand, and it's all within us, even our own death, right down to the death of everyone else. Hamlet stabs the king with the poisoned sword while he is listing his sins. The king dies quickly, and Laertes, hearing the litany of sins that Hamlet has brought out, sees the light, and he asks for forgiveness as he dies. Hamlet asks for it, which is an amazing insight into forgiveness after having done in Polonius, and he begins his farewells to the corpse of the queen and to Horatio. Horatio contemplates taking the poison drink himself for suicide, and Hamlet asks for the cup and asks him to forbear, painful though it may be, so that someone can live and tell the story. The show has to go on. Osric announces the arrival of Fortinbras. Hamlet says he is dying and that he can't hear the news from England, and he prophesies and cedes the throne to Fortinbras. What a noble thing. And then comes the speech. It's by Horatio. I don't even know if I can read it. It's so powerfully moving. Horatio says, "Thou cracks a noble heart. Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. Why does the drum come hither?" Fortinbras enters, and he's appalled at seeing the royal carnage. An ambassador from England arrives and announces the death of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and Horatio says he will explain. Fortinbras takes over and proceeds with honors for Hamlet as the play ends with a volley of shots in the distance. And the next talk will begin starting with the great themes and maybe carry a few of them out. Thank you very much.